In 2006, a scientist named John Marzluff put on a rubber mask, walked onto a university campus in Seattle, and trapped 7 crows. He banded their legs and let them go. The crows were fine, annoyed, but fine. He didn't do it again. He didn't need to. Years later, Marzluff could walk that same campus, in that same mask, and get mobbed by dozens of crows, screaming, dive-bombing, following him across the quad. Most of them had never been trapped. Most of them had never even watched him trap anything. Some of them hadn't been born yet in 2006. They hated the mask anyway, because their parents taught them to. Here's the question that actually matters. Not whether a crow can remember a face. It can, and we're about to see just how well. The question is whether what it's doing has a name you already know. Whether an animal can hold a grudge, and whether that grudge is anything like the ones you're still carrying. Marzluff's setup was careful. When his team trapped the crows, they wore one specific mask, a caveman face. When they walked the same routes, doing nothing threatening, they wore a different, neutral mask. Same clothes, same height, same path. The only thing a crow could use to tell friend from enemy was the face. It worked instantly. Show a crow the dangerous mask, and it scolds, follows, mobs. Show it the neutral one, and it barely looks up. The first study, published in the journal Animal Behavior in 2010, found the crows kept this up for at least 2.5 years, holding on to one face, out of every face they had ever seen, as the one that meant harm. But the part that turns a good memory into something stranger came next. In 2012, Marzluff's team published a follow-up in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, tracking how the grudge spread. A crow that got trapped learned the face firsthand. Fine, but crows that were never trapped, that only watched other crows scold the mask, learned to scold it too. That's the grudge moving sideways through the flock, like gossip, and then it moved down a generation. Young crows, born after the trapping, raised by parents who hated that mask, grew up hating it on their own. A face they had personally never seen do a single thing wrong. Over 5 years at one site, the scolding doubled and spread more than a kilometer from where it began. Marzluff once crossed campus in the mask and counted 47 out of 53 crows coming after him. 47 birds, almost none of whom he had ever touched. The grudge had stopped being a memory. It had become something closer to a rumor the whole neighborhood agreed on. And it lasted. Marzluff kept checking, year after year. The hostility peaked around 7 years in. Then, slowly, it started to fade. He had stopped trapping. The crows who carried the original bad memory grew old and died off. And in September of 2023, 17 years after he first put on that mask, Marzluff wore it across campus, and not one crow scolded him. Which tells you something honest about a grudge, even a crow's. It isn't permanent on its own. It has to be fed. Stop giving it new reasons. Let the ones who remember pass on, and eventually even a 17-year grudge goes quiet. So the crow remembers, but is it feeling anything? Or just running a reflex? In 2012, Marzluff worked with brain imaging researchers to look inside. They gave fully awake crows a marker that lights up the busiest parts of the brain, then showed them the threatening face. The regions that flared were the amygdala, the thalamus, the brainstem, the same circuitry that, in you and in most animals with a spine, handles fear, motivation, and the specific job of learning to be afraid of something. In other words, when a crow sees the face of someone who wronged it, its brain does roughly what your brain does when the person you can't forgive walks into the room. And it isn't only about physical danger. Sometimes the offense is smaller and more familiar than that. Sometimes it's just that someone cheated you. In 2017, researchers in Austria and Sweden taught ravens to trade. Hand the human a piece of bread, get a piece of cheese back, cheese being the far better deal, from a raven's point of view. Some humans played fair. Others took the bread, then ate the cheese right in front of the bird and gave nothing. The ravens noticed. When they were later allowed to choose which person to approach, they went to the fair traders and avoided the cheaters. One bad interaction was enough, and they still remembered it a month later. Nobody had threatened them. Nobody had hurt them. They just quietly filed away who could be trusted and who couldn't, and acted on it weeks after the fact. Birds are one thing, but this reaches all the way up to the largest land animal alive. In Amboseli, in Kenya, elephants live alongside 2 groups of people. The Maasai, who herd cattle and sometimes spear elephants that compete for water, and the Kamba, who farm and mostly leave the elephants alone. In 2014, a team led by biologist Karen McComb played recordings of men from both groups saying the exact same sentence: "Look, Look over there. A group of elephants is coming, to 48 elephant families. The elephants could hear the difference. A Maasai man's voice made them bunch together, back away, lift their trunks to smell the air. A Kamba man's voice, saying the identical words, barely moved them. Earlier work had found the same thing with the red clothing the Maasai wear, and even with the smell of it. The elephants weren't holding a grudge against one person. They were holding one against a whole category, a way of speaking, a color, a scent that their families had learned, over generations, meant danger. That's memory scaled up from a single face to an entire kind of person. In a human, we'd have a much heavier word for that. You might think all of this takes a big, unusual brain. A crow, a raven, an elephant. It doesn't. Northern mockingbirds are small songbirds that live on city streets and college lawns, surrounded by thousands of people a day. In a 2009 study at the University of Florida, a researcher walked up to a mockingbird's nest, threatened it briefly, and left. He came back the next day and did it again. And the next? By the fourth day, after just a couple of 30-second encounters, the birds were flushing off the nest while he was still far away, alarm calling and diving at him sooner each time. Then, on the fifth day, a different person approached the same nest, the same way. The birds treated him like a stranger. Calm, unbothered. They hadn't just gotten jumpy in general. They had memorized one specific human out of the thousands who walked past and saved the hostility for him. So, do animals hold grudges? Here's where I have to slow down, because grudge is a very human word, and it carries more than the science can actually prove. When you hold a grudge, there's a whole inner weather to it. You replay it, you stew, you resent. Nobody has ever measured that inside a crow. We can't open up a raven and find resentment sitting there. What we can measure is everything around it. These animals recognize a specific individual. They remember what that individual did, sometimes for years. They change how they act toward that one target and no one else. And crows, at least, pass the memory on, so it outlives the moment that made it. That's not nothing, but it also isn't proof that a crow lies awake at night, brooding. It might be something simpler, and honestly, more useful. A very sharp, very durable, very shareable memory of who hurt you, kept, because forgetting could get you killed. Except, sit with that for a second. Strip away the brooding and the replaying, and ask what your own grudges are actually for. Underneath all of it, a grudge is just a memory of who wronged you, sharp enough to change how you treat them years after the fact, running on the same amygdala, built for the same reason. The crow calls it survival. You call it never forgetting what they did to you. Somewhere, right now, an animal is carrying a face around in its head. Maybe a mask, maybe a red cloak, maybe just a person who cheated it once, and it is waiting to see that face again. It might even be yours. They're more like you than you think.